A few years ago, Tony was kind enough to give a talk on Eysenck for the RIOT Science Club, and I made him a promise that I would have him in person. And as a quick turnaround in typical academic style, here we are 3 years later. So my job here is to basically stay out the way, because I think we'll try and give as much time to our esteemed panel as much as possible. What I wanted to just quickly do is set the scene for everybody. The reason why I thought this was appropriate was because I recently read the Guardian article for which Tony was interviewed, and there's a great recording talking through Hans Eysenck and Tony's wonderful work on this. And I was surprised to see that there is a generational divide in people's awareness about Hans Eysenck. The younger people probably are not as aware of who he is and the impact he had on personality research in particular. So I'm just going to do a very, very quick throat clearing just to set the scene for everybody, and then hand it over to Tony and then to George, and then we'll have a panel discussion where Dorothy will be involved, and we'll talk about Eysenck, but also the broader issues about how do we, correct the scientific record and deal with misconduct. So Hans Eysenck, he died at aged 81, and at the time of his death he was the third most cited psychologist of all time, behind Piaget and Freud. And I think at the time of his death he was the most cited psychologist, and he has been ranked as the 13th most eminent psychologists, and that was back in 2002, but a recent poll ranked him as the 26th, so not that much of a drop down. I'm pleased to say that, Dorothy, I think you're ranked 22nd. And I think Eysenck would not be pleased to know that Michael Rutter is second. He's been awarded a variety of awards both here and across the pond, although notably he wasn't made the Fellow of the Royal Society. And so he was a big deal, and I won't go into the backstory, you can read it for yourself, but he had a considerable impact on psychology. He got in a load of dust-ups about Freud and psychoanalysis. He pretty much, built the field of personality, or definitely made it move leaps ahead in our understanding of personality and so on. There's a lot to commend, for his efforts and skepticism. However, his legacy has been somewhat tarnished, to put it lightly, by a number of cases of issues with falsification and fabrication, which we'll learn more about today. And this has left him with a very checkered reputation now. And this is from Rod Buchanan's book, which you'll be pleased to know this is a copy from the IOP library. And I want to thank the librarian who allowed me to take this out, even though I've got 3 other overdue books that are overdue by about 3 years. So hopefully I haven't just dobbed her in, but I'll be returning this in short order at the end. And George was pleased to point out that only twice has it been taken out, on the 2nd and the 24th of September 2010. And in there you can see there is a mixed bag of people lauding praise on Eysenck, and also those who have a very negative view of him. And you'll see, obviously, Michael Rutter appears up there again. So where are we at now in terms of his legacy? Well, Retraction Watch, brilliant initiative, has a database that records retractions, and Eysenck appears on that database. I should add that all the materials and slides and everything from the summer school are publicly available, and I've included the database from Retraction Watch on there, so if you want to search his papers, you can. And I quickly summed up and give you a broad, sort of a quick snapshot. So basically, there are 94 papers that are flagged on Retraction Watch, and of those 94, 21 are retracted. The rest have expressions of concern. And what's interesting is that of those 94, 36, I believe, are single author papers. So there are many other papers that have other authors on them. And I think that's kind of going to be an interesting part of the conversation later, which is what does that mean for the people that shared authorship with Eysenck. I would think we all are aware of the inquiry that was commissioned by KCL, thanks to the work by Tony, and you would be forgiven if you can't find it. If you click on the link provided on the KCL page, you'll just get a 404 error. So I have actually put the report on the OSF, so you can find that as well. You can find it in other places at Retraction Watch as well. I've got a copy, but it's there if you want to find it. Now, I'm going to leave the stage now, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Tony, because I think I've spoken more than enough. I'm going to remove this. Yeah, you can make your way over.
Good.
So, Tony, if you want to introduce yourself,
And the slides also come up.
and I'll put the slides up for you there. Now, you can just use the mouse here, or we've got a clicker for you.
Is there a clicker and a wee light?
You can. There's a light there, and it looks like a tennis ball. Well, it should do. There you go. Which I'm told is Eysenck's favourite sport.
Indeed.
Tennis.
Indeed.
Okay. So thank you so much.
That's the tennis ball, and that's the forward.
Yeah, that's the forward. Yeah.
Good. And,
okay. So thank you so much again, Tony. For
yes, and thanks so much for inviting me. I was a bit worried about this because I've been giving this talk in various versions over the years. Over the last 32 years, I think, I've been giving versions of this talk. And I've kind of got this dread that everybody has heard it before, and people are being polite. And I don't know, and when you become a consultant psychiatrist, I've got this thing, you've got your ward rounds, and there'll be a new trainee arrives, and you tell them maybe a clinical anecdote, or maybe a witty anecdote about psychiatry, the foibles in psychiatry, and something all very appreciative of it. I do notice with some colleagues, they've got this nice, very polite kind of smile, and kind of, and you say, have I said that to you before? Have I told you that story before? And they go, yes, doctor, last week and this morning. and so if I see any of you going, don't worry, I'll move on. Don't bear with me because there's some new material. But I'm going to be talking about personality and fatal disease, mainly cancer and ischemic heart disease, and work that Hans Eysenck did in this. And it really is amazing if you get the chance to look back through, for example, old adverts for cigarettes, going back 40s, 50s, all these big celebrities advertising cigarettes, and then one group that was this was the manufacturers of Camel cigarettes. They decided they should really get the doctors, see what the doctors are thinking in the 50s, and here it is that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, and I actually rather liked this doc here. I saw myself as a kind of Glasgow version of him, and it reads, I don't know if it's, he's one of the busiest men in town. That sounds good. And while his door maybe say office hours 2 to 4, he's actually on call 24 hours a day. But don't worry, I've switched off my phone for this. But the main thing, the doctor is a scientist, a diplomat, and a friendly, sympathetic human being, all in one, no matter how long and hard his schedule. So that's obviously the American family physician. And I thought today I was going to be a scientist, a diplomat, and a friendly, sympathetic human being, but a kind of Glasgow version of that. So I'm going to, and I should start then with my declaration of interest. And my only declaration, I mean, my family sold cigarettes and other tobacco products in an economically deprived area in Glasgow for 110 years. And it's not. And I was speaking to my brothers about this. It wasn't just cigarettes. It was almost every other tobacco product. And so I do remember sometimes it would be this thing of, oh my God, we've run out of chewing tobacco. It wasn't a big store of chewing tobacco. We've run out Mr. McDonald always comes on a Friday to get chewing tobacco. We're going to have to go to the Kashkari and get some chewing tobacco. And so in Glasgow, I mean, I don't know if it was so influential in Glasgow about if you go into the buses, it was always no spitting, penalty £5, and that was partly due to the chewing tobacco, but it was also partly, sadly, due to the bronchitis that so many men and women had in those days, and sadly, before then, it was due to tuberculosis, which isn't tobacco related. And you'll see, in fact, going back there, one of the things in the advert was your T-zone will tell you if the T for taste and T for throat. And it was this, with a Camel cigarette, you'll clear your throat nicer. And in Glasgow, it was that thing. So we'll have these Capstan full strength cigarettes. They'll help you clear your phlegm. You'll feel a lot better with Capstan full strength. So no, and it is amazing how things have changed then over the decades with this. So I thought I should start with this thing that the work that Hans Eysenck did before 1980, which is not the main part of this talk. It's not the main work I do. And he produced this book in December. It came out in December 1980. The book that the tobacco companies have been praying for, and what happened was that they had a press conference. He and his publisher had a press conference, and two epidemiologists and a statistician, Richard Peto and his brother, and three of them came to that press conference, and they had prepared a briefing document for the journalists, and they were saying to the journalists, please don't cover this story, please don't cover it. You can't do this because it is such bad work. And I'm trying to find this bit of paper that I had in which I wrote down. And the important phrase is that this work is trivially wrong. It's not wrong for complicated reasons that require a great deal of investigation. It's trivially wrong. And it's trivially wrong, and once it's pointed out how trivially wrong it is, it will be apparent to anybody, a scientist, a non-scientist, about how trivially wrong this is. And as part of this briefing paper, then he said, or as part of what he was then saying at this press conference. One of the trivial wrong things was he was saying, well, look, why have you not quoted this big study in the British Medical Journal that everybody really knows about smoking in doctors that Peto and Doll had done in Oxford? Why have you not quoted that? And Eysenck said, oh, it's because the book has been in press. It was published 4 years ago. It was published in 1976. Why have you not mentioned it? Because it's so important to what you're saying. And Eysenck said, but the book has been in press since 1976. And apparently, to great hilarity, a journalist then stood up and said, well, that's strange, Professor Eysenck, because I'm looking through the references here, and there's references every year since 1976, right up until this year. And so he got caught out with that. And then, because of this, well, what happened there was then on Newsnight, BBC Two Newsnight, the following day. Him and Richard Peto were on Newsnight the following day. And I think it is worth worthwhile just looking at a few minutes of it.
Now, Professor Eysenck makes a good deal of play of the fact that there appears to be not very much difference in the ratios between men and women of the rate at which they get lung cancer, whereas you'd expect there to be very substantial differences because of the different times at which they started to smoke. Would you like to elaborate on that?
The rate of increase has been very similar for men and women. Now, this may be due to the fact, as Dr. Petto points out, that we have improved our methods of ascertainment.
Of diagnosis?
Of diagnosis, because diagnosis were extremely unreliable until the 1950s and later. But of course, much of the correlational evidence is based on these unreliable diagnoses. But I would like to point out one further point, which makes me unwilling to accept correlational evidence too readily. And that is that even if smoking is in part responsible for lung cancer, it is not a necessary cause, because 1 in 10 of lung cancer sufferers has not smoked. And it is not a sufficient cause, because only 1 in 10 heavy smokers will get lung cancer. So we are dealing with a very complex kind of array of causes. And some of these, I think, are undoubtedly congenital, related to personality and so forth. And these factors tend to be omitted.
Let us take these things up one by one. First of all, what about the diagnosis point, Richard Peto?
Everybody has accepted for over 30 years, most people have accepted for over 30 years, that there are very large artifacts, there are very large errors in diagnosis in the old days, and that progressive correction of these has changed the apparent number of lung cancers. What I find bizarre is that today in this interview you say the sex ratio is increasing. That's true. Around the turn of the century, lung cancer was twice as common among men as among women. By the middle of the century, it was 10 times as common among men as among women. So the sex ratio is increasing. That's what you say today. Yesterday, in your book published yesterday, you say the patterns of sex distribution in lung cancer have not changed since the 19th century. Today, you say that the increase is strong evidence for cigarette smoking causing lung cancer. Yesterday, at your press conference, or in the book published yesterday, you say these facts are quite incompatible with the hypothesis that smoking causes cancer.
What you are saying in any case is that this increase in the ratio, the fact that more men than women are getting lung cancer, relates directly to the fact that men started smoking earlier. That's your evidence, is it?
It is what one would expect. Men started around the First War, and so by 1950 lung cancer was 10 times as common among men as among women.
And is the women's increase in lung cancer rate also showing through as they have been smoking for a longer period of time?
Oh, well, women started in this country round about the Second War, and since about 1950, the male rates in middle age have been reasonably stable. But now, of course, the female rates in middle age are going up very rapidly.
And that is what you'd expect if there was a link between lung cancer and smoking?
Of course.
Professor Eysenck, can you comment on that briefly?
I think if this trend continues, this will certainly, again, prove very strong evidence for the cancer hypothesis.
Strong evidence for the cancer hypothesis.
Yes.
Well, then what are you casting doubt on?
I'm just waiting for the final figure, say in 10, 20 years' time, to see whether these changes that have begun, in fact, carry through and are still related to the rate of smoking and so on.
Does Professor Eysenck appear to be admitting what you have been arguing, Richard Peto?
Well, it's very rapid progress over the last 24 hours from facts quite incompatible with the smoking causes cancer hypothesis into strong evidence for the cancer hypothesis, talking about the very same data.
He had said in his book that the sex ratios had been similar over the decades, and it was clear, he's saying, strong evidence that, no, these are facts quite incompatible with the hypothesis that smoking causes cancer. And then the final thing that Peto said, because they got him to say, well, look at the sex ratios and the ratios changing as more men smoked. The men were smoking and so few women smoked, and then women started catching up after the Second World War. And Peto saying, well, what progress in 24 hours from that strong evidence to support that smoking causes lung cancer, compared with these are facts quite incompatible with smoking causing cancer. And it was one of the things, though, that Eysenck said was, I'm just waiting for another 10 or 20 years to see whether this trend continues. And I put it to you that thing in December 1980, Eysenck showed unparalleled irresponsibility as a scientist in December 1980. And now I'm about to start my talk, because things then got much worse. Actually, that's wrong. It's not much worse. They got so much worse. But something should have been done about Eysenck in 1980. What could you do? What could you do? Something should have done. And he went on, and he started then. He then teamed up with a chap called Ronald Grossarth-Maticek, a kind of shadowy figure that no one really knows his background, but he had done these enormous studies in former Yugoslavia, now Serbia, Crvenka, and in Heidelberg. And they had 4 personality types based on Eysenck's theories and Grossarth-Maticek's clinical observations. There's a cancer-prone type, specifically in the face of stressful stimulation, ischemic heart zone disease prone, inability to leave an unsatisfactory situation, which increases anger and hostility, a mixed type, and a healthy autonomous personality. And they'd done these big studies. Grossarth-Maticek had done these big studies, over 1,000 in Yugoslavia, two of them over 1,000 in Heidelberg. And the disease-prone personalities, these weren't rare personalities. It was more than a quarter were cancer-prone. And some of the studies were fairly representative populations for these places. A quarter were coronary heart disease prone, 30% nearly a healthy autonomous type. And all I did was just get that data and bring it all together and just present it in a slightly different way from what they had presented, just so that you could give the relative risk. How many times more likely were people to, say, develop heart disease if they had a particular personality? I sometimes ask audiences, just for example, if you were, say you were a smoker, because there is this thing about smoking is a clear risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So say you were a 20 a day person, 20 cigarettes a day all your life, how much more likely, all other things being equal, would you be to develop a heart attack or a heart disease, ischemic heart disease, because of the smoking? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. I mean, are you 1.5 times more likely? Are you 10 times more likely? Is there any takers? Any takers? I mean, George will know this inside out. You're not allowed to say, but any takers? Maybe there's no smokers in the room. Because sometimes I do surprise. Some people say, "Well, it's a massive increase in risk," or others saying, "Well, it's a tiny increase in risk." But I think maybe it's a moderate to heavy smoker, maybe twice as likely to develop heart disease over the have a heart attack or die of heart disease. And I'll come on to the cancer thing later. So wait a minute. Forward. I will go forward. Just go forward. I'll do that. Do it there. So I've left out the result for coronary heart disease. But as you'll see, the baseline is the healthy type, you call them a baseline with a relative risk of 1. And right enough, this mixed type, they're 4 times more likely to develop to die actually of heart disease over the ensuing decade. And the cancer-prone type they're not just cancer-prone, they're also prone to developing coronary artery disease. They were 7 times more likely to die of coronary artery disease. And if this works, I'll just do this. And there you are. So they were right. The coronary heart disease prone types, based on this interview done by Grossarth-Maticek and his colleagues, they were 27 times more likely to die of heart disease. Now, if that was replicated, or rather if it was replicated by somebody else, because they did replicate, these are three big studies, all of which have their results going in the same direction. That would be the most important finding ever in the history of the study of ischemic heart disease, which is the biggest killer of people in the Western world, and the biggest cause of premature death in the developed world, and in the developing world more recently as well. So the most important they're claiming the most important finding in the history of the study of ischemic heart disease. So, but what about then the cancer one? And maybe once again, anybody want to shout out about, if you're 20 a day man or a 20 a day woman, all your days, right from adolescence, how likely are you over the years? How much more likely are you than your neighbour to develop, your non-smoking neighbour to develop just lung cancer, not all cancer, just lung cancer? Twice as likely. Any advance on twice? Any advance on twice? I think, and George, I think for a 20 a day man, it's about 10 times more likely. And for women, maybe 15, it's actually a bit more for women. And maybe for a 40 a day man, of which there was a great many used to come into our shop as well. A 40 a day person, you're maybe talking about 30 or 40 times more likely to develop lung cancer, just to develop lung cancer. But just lung cancer, and there's about a dozen cancers with lower relative risk, but it does seem to be related to smoking. But there's lots of cancers where there isn't a relationship between smoking, a relationship with smoking. So once again, I've left out the number. I'm going to take off my jacket actually, because I'm not going to get carried away, but I'm going to take off my jacket. So once again, the coronary artery disease prone type was 14 times more likely to develop cancer. And this isn't just lung cancer, this is all cancers. And which, if you lump together all cancers, they're the biggest cause of premature death in the world. But that's if you lump them all together. But what about then their prediction? Were their cancer-prone types really prone to cancer? And the answer is, going to them, they were 121 times more likely. And I remember when we first wrote about this, I was saying it's the largest relative risk ever found in non-infectious disease epidemiology. And so if you take that along with especially on the coronary artery disease results, and the fact this was 3 studies all going in the same direction with these big things, that's the most important finding in the history of medicine. If anybody was to produce that is the most important finding by far in the history of medicine. So that was observational work. If there's these personality features, should we not try and do something about that? And this way, both Eysenck and Grosvenor are saying we have to do something about this. And say, well, let's do a randomised trial, and we'll put people with. They had these other nearly 30,000 subjects that they had interviewed, and they got them into randomised trials of psychotherapy. And it was a kind of, they called it creative novation behaviour therapy, and it was quite a nice therapy, a mixture of behavioural therapy and cognitive therapy with some relaxation methods, and not particularly unusual. I didn't think in the descriptions that I have of it, and there we are. This is the heart disease, and if you were treated, and this was individual psychotherapy from Ronald Grossart-Matichek. If you were treated, 6 died of other causes, and your heart disease, but only 3 died of heart disease out of 46. But if you hadn't received that treatment, well, 13, a lot more from other causes, and 16 died of heart disease, so 5 times more likely to die of heart disease if you were randomized, if you hadn't got this treatment from Ronald Grosarth-Maticek. And once again, I mean, we've had the most important finding in the history of heart disease, the most important finding in the history of medicine. This would be the most important finding in the history of science as well. But what about cancer? So 50 were treated with this one-to-one psychotherapy. 5 died of various other causes, but nobody died of cancer, even though according to them, they were cancer prone. And here's their result. You were lucky if you got randomized to get psychotherapy for Ronald Grosarth-Maticek, because 16 died if they didn't get that. And they were saying, well, once again, one-to-one psychotherapy, that's quite expensive. You can't go around giving one-to-one psychotherapy to everyone. This is huge public health importance. Let's do group therapy. Let's do group cognitive behavioural, creative innovation behavioural therapy. And they did it with Grosarth-Maticek and some specially trained students did it. And big numbers, 245 were treated with group therapy. 235 were untreated, and after 7 years, only 20% who got the group therapy had died. 76% who did not get the group therapy had died. 3 times less likely to die. Now, that is not the most important history. These are not the most important findings in the history of medicine, and they're not the most important findings in the history of science. What they are claiming here is the pinnacle of all human achievement. They're claiming to have sorted cancer. And en passant, they've sorted coronary heart disease. So they're claiming the pinnacle of all human achievement. But that's not all. And I like that. They didn't stop at claiming the pinnacle of all human achievement. They decide, well, it's really expensive to give group therapy. How are we going to get staff for that? Let's try bibliotherapy. Let's give them a pamphlet. And that's their word. We gave them a pamphlet on creative innovations behaviour therapy, albeit with an additional 5 hours of individualised discussion of its content. And I do remember Sam discussing with you that thing. I put in a paper, and the referee tried to stop me, but I had this wee pamphlet. And the referee said, you can't use the word we in a scientific paper. I use the word we all the time. We's a nice word. They gave them a wee pamphlet. We is my word, but the pamphlet is their word. And there is the wee pamphlet. Now, anyone who's maybe saying, maybe a follower of Eysenck, you can maybe say, I'm going to read that quickly. That'll be good for me. And well, that's 2/3. That's 2/3 of the pamphlet. And that's the other third of the pamphlet. Now, I wonder if it worked. I wonder how it did. Could they do better than the pinnacle of all human achievement? And lo and behold, they did. So after 13 years, 32% of those given the pamphlet were dead, and 83% of the untreated were dead. And these people were all within 2 papers. And I remember reading and saying, pull yourself together, Anthony. You're not reading this right. It must be you. This is a peer-reviewed journal. This is Behaviour Research and Therapy. A very good journal, founded by Hans Eysenck. And there it is sitting there in black and white. So that was, I felt, just those data, not data, just those findings was a scientific scandal. Now, as it is, there's also a terrible ethical scandal, which I'm briefly going to discuss. And together, I'm going to put to you all, and it's a wee competition I want really with the audience and my friends, my colleagues. I'm going to say this is the worst scientific scandal of all time, excluding medical atrocities that took place in totalitarian states. If we put them to the side, I'm going to put this forward or nominate this for the worst scientific scandal of all time. And of course, we'll end up then having a debate. I would like a debate. Right? It's one of these debates, like, who's the best footballer of all time? You know, you can never say, you know, it was Pele or Maradona. Well, but how can you compare Pele with Bobby Moore? Bobby Moore was a defender. You know, you can't really have. But I like those discussions about football. In fact, everybody knows that the best footballer of all time was Jimmy Johnson. Everyone knows that. But anyway, that's a. But it doesn't. It's not really meaningful. But it's my nomination for the worst scientific scandal of all time, especially when I then describe this next bit, because one of their work was looking at people's the blood vessels. What's happening to people's blood vessels who are prone to developing coronary artery disease as well as stroke? And what you can actually look at the small blood vessels at the back of the eye. And so they did a study on changes in degree of sclerosis as a function of the treatment of coronary heart disease probands and cancer-prone probands. And this is in, once again, a peer-reviewed journal, Behaviour Research and Therapy. And there is, you know, that's the back of the eye. That's the back of a healthy eye. I don't know if there are any ophthalmologists in there. I think actually quite handsome retina. Too handsome. They're actually mine. These are my retinas. These are my retinas. I put it to my wife. I think this is my best feature. Yeah. But healthy and a nice clear optic disc. In fact, I'm going to go on because it's not as high quality a photo. It's a higher quality photo of a healthy retina. So just this is the optic disc here. Oh, sorry, no one. This is the optic disc, and you can see these a nice well-defined optic disc here. You see that the white bit, and where the veins are going in and the arteries coming out, and a lovely looking healthy retina. Now, in that paper then, Eysenck and Grosarth-Maticek then describe that there were a lot of people with these appearances, and it's something called cotton wool spots. These are called, and that's a sign of a leakage of fluid into the back of the eye from the blood vessels. I've done it again. And there's these things are flame-shaped hemorrhages here. There's some hemorrhages into the back of the eye, and that's a very worrying sign. And your doctor would have to do something about that. That's a sign of severe hypertension. But it can go further than that. And that's the sign of malignant hypertension, where the optic disc loses that crispness. The optic disc becomes all blurred, and these big distended veins in the eye. And that's a very sinister sign. If you were to see that, some general practitioners, when you work in the hospital, some general practitioners would call an ambulance and take people in with that. You know, somebody come in with a headache, look to the back of the eyes, and if they had a high blood pressure, oh my goodness, we'll have to do something about that. Others would say, look, get a taxi, you've not to drive, but you deal with that there and then, that day. So they described this in some of their subjects. I'll go into the numbers in a minute. And there it was. So, and that was that last appearance, the malignant hypertension, clearly described in great detail in this paper. 41 people were identified who had the retinal appearance of malignant hypertension, and their mean blood pressure was 207 millimeters of mercury. For people of that age, it should have been maybe about 130, 140. They got individual psychotherapy, and then a year later, 51 of them had those sinister appearances in the back of their eye, and their blood pressure had gone up. And 13 years later, 43 of them had died of heart disease. So they weren't treated that first year. It looks as if they weren't being treated at all. Now, that between those two issues, all that observational data, the randomized control trials, it's terrible scientific scandal. And then an ethical scandal that competes with some of the worst of the ethical scandals. That's why it could be a great debate, which is the worst scandal. And why I could put this forward is that this is the worst scientific scandal of all time, except I'm going to wind back, because I honestly, and this is me coming to the defence of Professor Eysenck and Professor Magic, I don't believe that that actually happened. I don't think that ever took place. How on earth could they have got 41 people with malignant hypertension from Heidelberg during the course of one study? I just don't believe it happened. I've listed various reasons why I don't believe it happened. So I'm undermining my nomination for the worst scientific scandal of all time. It's still scandalous. But I just don't believe that. I don't believe it. I hope to God I'm right, that it never actually happened. It's shocking. So and there are loads of other things I could mention, loads and loads of other findings that nobody else had ever come across. And myself and Lewis Appleby, some of whom you'll know, used to work. He trained here, and he and I wrote this article in the British Medical Journal saying, look, something's going on here, and there needs to be an inquiry. We said the Institute of Psychiatry, now the Institute of Psychiatry, and then the Institute of Psychiatry, they have to have an inquiry into this, because what on earth is going on? This is a big worry for science and certainly for psychology as well, that one of its best known practitioners is coming away with this stuff. And Eysenck answered, but he didn't answer our points. He just said his usual things about you should have contacted me and I could have explained it all to you, things like that. And we answered again, listing lots of other problems and saying, come on, this is a crisis for science and psychology. And I do remember the editor of the BMJ was saying, oh, here we go, we'll get the journalists involved, this will be amazing. And nothing really happened. There wasn't inquiry. Some journalists were kind of interested, but they didn't see it through. And I think what it was is some of the ways it was worded, it had been altered by the lawyers to make sure that the BMJ couldn't get sued and me and Lewis Appleby couldn't get sued. So they would put the way they would frame, it was clear that how outrageous some of this was, but they framed it in such a way that someone just coming and having a quick look at it say, well, this is a scientific controversy. We couldn't talk about fraud or we don't believe that they actually happened and things like that. And nothing happened for years. So nothing happened. And I must say I was kind of disappointed, but life goes on, and I went on with things. And so there was then this, I'm going to go through some of I've left out some of the layers within this multi-layered scientific scandal, only because of time, because I do want time to discuss with you all about this. But some of the layers are that we published saying, come on, the Institute of Psychiatry, you've got to do an inquiry into this. And I ended up 3 times, we said, and it was never done. And I was up looking to see if I could find the annual reports. And the annual reports continued to list these papers in the report, the Institute's report. And in 1995, I made a formal complaint to the British Psychological Society about the scientific flaws and their claims to have done a grossly unethical treatment trial. And they said further treatment was not appropriate. And we hope you're satisfied that this has been dealt with. And I wasn't satisfied. But what was I to do? What can I do? What can you do? And I do remember thinking, what was it you were saying? This will come back, and one of the speakers earlier, this will come back, and it'll be a problem for you in the future. And fortunately, the British Psychological Society have now dealt with their side of this. And so it went on and on over those years, and as my family, we had a family and our 2 boys, and we went round as we went round, like we'd go on our holidays. And I said, come on, boys, let's go to the Science Museum. Science Museum, why? Oh, you'll really enjoy it, And let's go to the British Psychological Society's Mind Your Head exhibition. And so it was something to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the British Psychological Society. And in we went, and I knew this was there. And in we went, and there was Eysenck's Biosignal Laboratory, funded by R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, dominating this celebration of British psychology in the Science Museum. And if I've got time, and I was saying, boys, you must appreciate this. You must appreciate it. This shows the fragility of science. Because this is the dominant feature, all the other wee glass cases, and this is dominant. And it's only your daddy knows the fragility of science. And my boy said, Mum, Dad's talking rubbish again. And I went, all right, I'm not the only, it's not only your dad. Lewis Appleby, he also knows. He said, Dad? I said, well, all right, the entire staff of the BMJ also clocked about the fragility of science. George Davey Smith, it took him 5 minutes to look at it and say that this is, all right, George, George knows as well. And every other psychologist, doctor, epidemiologist who looked at it and published it, many of them published on it, but you could see you had to read between the lines of their publications because they weren't being, they couldn't say something that was libelous in their publication. So I was saying, but other than those hundreds of people, your daddy's the only one who knows about the fragility of science. And it is very, very important for them, and they forgave me. So, so we were there, and once again, nothing happened. And so the other layers, they continue to be widely cited, sometimes uncritically cited in undergraduate psychology textbooks. And I kept an eye on the new editions over the years for them. They've been included in meta-analyses of the association between personality and disease, and which is very, very worrying that there were these meta-analyses of personality and cancer studies. And there were things, most of the relative risks were around about 1, so there wasn't really much in it. But something maybe about 1.5, so something maybe 50% more, and very important findings. And I remember there was one study, I think with melanoma, and there was an association of 2 within this. And I said, this is important work. What it all means, I'm not sure, but it's very important work. But Eysenck and Grossart-Maticek's work was included in it. And so you get all these plots, but they were getting relative risks the way they calculated it, 26, 58, 75, up against these relative risks of 1 or 1.2 or 1.5, sometimes 2. So I think really undermining the work of the people who were doing this, I think very important research on psychosocial influences on health. They've been included in large and important cohort studies and don't find much. And it seems like a wasted opportunity that's happened there for these. And then they've also been used. There've been studies conducted with measures on desperately ill patients dying of cancer, and these patients are being handed these questionnaires, Grossart-Maticek and Eysenck's questionnaires. And then this multi-layered scientific scan. Eysenck's younger colleagues and the International Society for the Study of Individual Differences, which he was the founding president of. And they kept egging him on about being a genius. And I think that relates to some of the problems that have occurred in science. It's there in the literature. A Danish chap, Helmut Nyborg, publishes this thing and saying, oh, Hans, we had a meeting, Hans, I told you, Hans, you are like Johann Sebastian Bach, or Mozart, you are a Mozart of science, you are such a genius. And I said, what's going on? What's going on here? How can they be, and it was him and a whole what would the word be, a whole gang or coterie or a group of acolytes telling him that he was a genius. You can just see how it happened. And yeah, I suppose in some ways tragically also, I mean, his wife as well. This is their website, which still exists, and you can look it up. This is the Hans and Sybil Eysenck website. And after Hans died, and Sybil had a longer life, and it was very, very sad that this all started coming out before she died, so she knew that there were problems were brewing for her husband. But she was doing an autobiography. And the name of the title of her autobiography was "I Married a Genius." I do remember when I came across that website, I said to my wife Karen, have you seen this? Look, there's Sybil Eysenck she's saying "I married a genius." Isn't that terrible, Karen? And my wife said, well, she's lucky because I married a dafty. Because you shouldn't be spending your time on this work. You should just get on with it. But I mean, very sad in a way, kind of tragic. So so once again there was that happened, and once again nothing was happening. Nothing happened. And then the tobacco industry, which I'm going to skip over, there was all this additional information started coming out when the tobacco documents became available. And I am going to skip over, but Eysenck was there giving there's the thing within the documents of Eysenck giving evidence to the Senate about the dangers, and that's him along with the chairman of R.J. Reynolds giving evidence to the US Senate. And I'm saying, well, you know, nothing's happening, there's no inquiry, but the historians will deal with this. And that's when this book came out. And I apologise to those who have heard this before. I always wondered, where is that book? I knew it was being produced, but it was years and years and nothing happened. And then I was down in London in that big bookcase, that big bookshop in Bloomsbury, and there it was in the window. And I remember I went, and so I said, there it is at last. I've been waiting for it. But the shop was closed, and I was thinking of going and rapping on the window or the door to the security guard and saying, look, I am a doctor. I need that book urgently. and I was like, oh, you can't really do that. You can't really do that. But I went and looked it up online, and there it was. I hope you can read that. But there's a table of contents online, still the same table of contents online. And chapter 9 is smoking, cancer, and the F word. So the fraud word. And it's going to say, well, finally someone is actually going to say it's fraud. And I went back the next morning and bought my copy of the book, and flicking through it, and they had changed it. It had been made to, Rod Buchanan had been made to change it by his publishers to smoking, cancer, and the final frontier. They weren't allowed to use he wasn't allowed to use the fraud word. And so that book came out, still very critical and raising huge questions, and still nothing happened. Still nothing happened. That was in 2010, I think, and nothing happened. And then, I'll be a few minutes now, until in 2015, I got contacted that the personality and individual differences, which was really Hans Eysenck's journal. He created that. He created that journal in 1980, and they were going to do something to celebrate his the centenary of his birth. And Philip Corr, the guest editor, had heard that I was interested in this. He never heard me speak though, and he never heard me, and he hadn't read my papers either. And he said, "Well, could you write a paper on this, and about what's the latest in regard to personality and cancer, personality and heart disease?" And I do remember I got an email somewhere saying, "Are you really sure you want me to write an article to celebrate this man's 100th birthday or the centennial? Are you sure you want to?" "Oh no, we're scientists, and go for it." So I produced a paper, and I did feel sorry for the editor really, because there it was then, laying out all my concerns, in much more detail and more examples within that paper. And they sent it to the lawyer. They sent it to the lawyers, and they ended up sending it to 9 referees. And the law, it was mainly the lawyers. It was screeds of things. Oh, we don't like the tone. It's only you who's got any concerns about this. And it was just the way I had written it. So I rewrote it, giving much more of quotations from other people's papers on it. And it went back and forth for ages. And eventually, right enough, I got an acceptance letter. And there it was. They sent me the proofs. I corrected the proofs, and there is the proof, personality and individual differences, 2016. I corrected the proofs, sent them back. I think these were the corrected proofs. And I do remember thinking, I got a wee bit emotional as I finished it off. And I went to my wife, and said, told you so. I told you I'd get something done about this. It's going to come in. She said, well, you win, you got it in. I then got an email. Were spiking it. They wouldn't publish it. The editor-in-chief wouldn't publish it. He said it was because of the legal things. I said, well, I've made changes, but according to the lawyer, but he refused to publish it. And I went on and on. It was for 3 years, and I think I ended up submitting it to, I think it was 12 different journals. And I was getting rejections. Most of the rejections were very good reports back from the editor. But one of the main things was, well, look, we do not have the resources to take this on. If we get sued, and it's not financial resources, what's this going to do to the time for our office? But eventually, I was going to give up, but eventually I said, well, I'll try the Journal of Health Psychology. And the editor there went for it. He was enthusiastically went for it. And he sent it to King's with a very firm, open letter saying that something must be done. And they finally did this inquiry. But they only looked into the papers published by Eysenck and with Grossack Maticek as one of the authors, and some other authors as well. And they ended up saying that the 26 papers were unsafe. And they started then retracting things. Some of the journals retracted the single-authored ones, including that, does smoking really kill anybody, with Hans being really outrageous and really undermining public health with this thing. And the main thing for me was eventually Behaviour Research and Therapy retracted that paper describing these people with malignant hypertension dying. And I was so delighted with that. And unfortunately, Hans's journal, Personality and Individual Differences, they said, no, we're not convinced that this is unsafe work. We're going to call this potentially unsafe. And these were Hans's colleagues, tennis partners, former PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, and they all put their name to this thing, saying we're not going to retract this. It's just going to be an expression of concern. And I'm kind of annoyed about that. Something should be done about that to get them to get a move on and see this through. And Rod Buchanan, the author of this, he's saying, wait a minute. If you look at Eysenck's sole author papers, you're talking then about, he reckons about 81 papers should be retracted with this work. I'd say a more conservative thing would be more about 75, 76. But you could argue about if he's just mentioned something should be retracted. But he's saying 81 should be retracted. And that's about it, really. There's more should be done. The British Psychological Society did set up a group to look at this and other problems, past problems within psychology, and they joined me. It was called the Challenging Histories Group. It was really brilliant, a brilliant group of people, and there was only one paper from the British Psychological Society they had done from this body of work, and I I looked at, we did an expression of concern about that and said it is the responsibility, though, of the Institute of Psychiatry to recommend retraction of this. We're not going to do the Institute of Psychiatry's job, but this is clearly unacceptable, this work. And indeed, I couldn't find the paper I had, my paper copy of this. I said, well, I'll just Google it and find it. And I found it on that website, which is a website all about health and wellness, kind of alternative medicine, a lot of some good advice, some less good advice. But that was where I found that PDF with a Google. So that I think there are millions of people, ordinary people, still reading this stuff, reading stuff like that, which makes these outrageous claims. And in my view, people are making decisions about their lifestyle, decisions about smoking, based on some of this stuff. So, thanks very much for your attention. Thank you.
So we're going to now transition over to George Davey Smith's segment of the talk. So if you do have questions, just save them up, and we'll present them to the panel at the end of George's segment. You want your video played at the beginning, is it? Yeah. So I'm going to try, but it might be that, it might be that we have to. Okay, so I don't know whether you want to tee this up, George.
Yeah, Eysenck came and gave a talk in Edinburgh, and Tony asked Tom if I should come along. But I'd been sent a paper by the British Medical Journal about a couple of years before. One of the papers was got published in one of the psychology journals, and I said not only should they not obviously consider that paper, but they should investigate all things that had been done with this team had done, because it was clearly fraudulent. And Richard Smith did. You did write something for that you wrote for the MJ. So anyway, and Eysenck presented. And he presented all the sorts of results that Tony said, and this was Tony asked him about the ethical nature of the work, the highly unethical nature, and I said to him that it was impossible, and this is his response.
So if you can, I'll just play the video. So I think it might not be audible to those listening in remotely, so I will submit a link to so you can watch it. But it's openly available on YouTube anyway, so you can watch it. But I'm sure George will sort of give a quick précis of it anyway. So I'll play this now.
You keep saying that people in medicine and epidemiology are critical of your work, or in fact largely ignore it. And so I'll tell you as a medical epidemiologist why that is. It is that we simply, when we see this work, we can't believe it. That is not just because we're coming with our own beliefs, our Cartesian worldview. It is also that your data are actually internally impossible. Many of the things you showed, I could actually demonstrate this, but I'll just take two of your slides like you showed, and I will say that those two things cannot both be true. You showed a slide at the follow-up relating RO personality type to lung cancer, in which you divided the group into 2/3 group with high score, 1/3 group with low score. All 38 lung cancers occurred in the group with low score. Not a single lung cancer occurred in the other group. That's one slide you showed, you asked us to see. Secondly, you showed a slide which quite rightly pointed out that there is change in these things over time. You showed that over 6 months later, some of the people who had higher scores now had low scores. Some people who had low scores had high scores. If you followed people up for a year, there would have been even more change. For 5 years, even more change. That means there is misclassification according to the RA score type. Some people, just because when you saw them, 6 months you saw them scoring high, for most of their lives they would have scored low. Your own data, the data you showed showing the change, shows that. What that means is that in your low scoring group, you are misclassifying. There are some high scorers. Also in your high group, there are a lot of low scorers who must therefore be at risk of lung cancer, like your other low scorers. Therefore, it is then impossible that you therefore get no cases of lung cancer in that group because of misclassification. Even when looking at a cohort of HIV and AIDS, you don't get the relative risks you're showing because HIV tests are sometimes wrong. But I assure you, HIV tests classify people better and in a more stable way than do your questionnaires. Those two slides you show with your own data are just simply cannot both be possibly be true. And that is why my colleagues in medical epidemiology will not take this work seriously and will not push for these sorts of studies to be taken further. Serious studies, yes, but this work, I think, doesn't merit serious consideration.
Well, it's an interesting point, but you forget that if you excluded everything that Grossart Maticek has ever done, the point would still be exactly the same. The work of Caroline Thomas, for instance, if anything, gives better results than those that Grossart Maticek has obtained. There are quite a large number of other people who have since replicated the work of Grossart Maticek and got as good or better results than he has. So if you excluded everything that Grossart Maticek has, that would make no difference to the conclusion I would draw from the data that have been published, but still come to exactly the same. There is a very strong evidence that personality and stress factors produce a very profound effect on a person's liability to develop cancer or coronary heart disease.
It just says that their work has been replicated. I came back just saying I know the work of Caroline Thomas very well, and the relative risks are like 1.4 as opposed to 100. So what they claim as being replications are studies which get very small effects. They're not replicating these ludicrous effect sizes. But this is, I thought that was worth saying because that's exactly how he responded to criticism right the way across his career. And what I will show, if I have,
just bear with me.
Is just how this was just persistent behaviour right the way through across his career. He would mention all his new work. So people always wrote criticisms. Right from the very, very early stages, people would write statistical criticisms, saying that statistics do not say what you say they say, reanalyzing the summary data and saying that. And he would always come back with some unpublished work by some PhD student, which hadn't yet been published, but was going to show all this was true. And it's his response right the way across his career. So it's traditional to thank the organisers for when you get invited to talk, but I don't know whether I really want to thank the organisers because this has ruined my life for the last 2 months having to go back and read Eysenck stuff because it really does screw your head up reading this stuff because it's impossible. It's like sort of walking through custard. Because there's just one more thing, and you couldn't even work out how many studies they did. With it's ridiculous. Details just aren't given. So, yeah, thanks. But and Philip Cord thought that response was brilliant. At 80 years of age, Eysenck presents a long lecture apparently off the top of his head, and then responds to some highly critical questions and statements. Tony and me, with the calm denial of the validity of the points put to him. So anyway, so I'm going to say why Eysenck on smoking, his denial of smoking as having health damaging effects, and the necessity of Grossart Maticek's impossible findings for that claim. And then I'm going to just go through some couple of other examples of this bait and switch that he did right the way across his career, and then discuss his O.J. Simpson moment. So why are the findings impossible? So as I was just describing there, and I did some calculations for the British Medical Journal to demonstrate this, is if you take measurement error into account, there is a limit of what you can actually get, what precision you can have of identification. And in many of their studies, they went beyond that possible limit. i.e. if they actually had a construct which explained 100%, could discriminate absolutely perfectly between people who are going to get cancer and were not going to get cancer, you could still not get what they actually showed. You couldn't get things as good as they showed given the measurement error. And at the time, I'd been working on that, as I'll come to, and I thought this was original, but it was totally unoriginal. And Eysenck had heard it many times before. Tony found this letter. He talked about the tobacco industry letter. Material. There's a vast amount of material about Eysenck on the archives that have had to be made available for legal reasons, where the tobacco companies funded many researchers such as Eysenck. And this is a letter from David Gilbert, who was a psychologist who at that stage was working for R.J. Reynolds. He left R.J. Reynolds and carried on doing good psychophysiology, etc. He might still be working, I don't know. But he just explains exactly the same thing. He just says, I've looked at these data that you're showing. We've got some retest reliability estimates. You can't show what you've seen. And then he says, he gives the best interpretation. Chance may have sided in the direction of the hypothesis. It might just be incredible good luck. But he says, he's then worried because of these so-called intervention studies, and I wonder if some bias may have inadvertently entered into Gross and Matichek's data. But he's saying it's impossible. And one of the tobacco industry statisticians, someone very well paid by the tobacco industry, Peter P.N. Lee, he said this in Psychological Inquiry, which I hadn't seen until I read some of this stuff for this meeting. So Eysenck had heard all that before. He'd heard it before, but there was still, it was just flannel in response. So how did Eysenck get into smoking research? So in his autobiography, Rebel with a Cause, he says, Miss Tarrant from Mass Observation Limited, which by then was a market research company, had been asked to get 3 or 4 scientists together for a radio discussion on smoking. Would I take part? I agreed, so he says, yes, I'll take part, and decided that first I would read a bit about cigarette smoking. I tried to link up smoking with some of my work on personality, so he just actually went out to link it to something that he knew about. Miss Tarrant told me the Tobacco Research Council are interested in financing research and personality correlates to smoking. Was I willing to direct the research? Certainly. So it was happy days, and that was the beginning of the tobacco industry funded. Tobacco Research Council was funded by the tobacco industry. Later it shifted just to direct R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, and other tobacco company money. And this paper was the basis of everything. They'd hypothesized that that 3 personality factors would relate to smoking. 2 of them did, and then they referenced R.A. Fisher, who would claim that maybe genetics could confound the association of smoking and lung cancer. The stuff that came out in all these are the books, 65, 80, and 1991 books. It was the same story. That was it. It was that the personality influences smoking and influences the health outcomes, and that's why a non-causal association is generated. And the belief was just carried on. In the American Journal of Epidemiology in 1989, Jan Vanderbrugge wrote a piece called Those Who Were Wrong, and he mentioned Eysenck, he mentioned Fisher and Eysenck on smoking and said, at the time, maybe it was reasonable. He was trying to actually say, we shouldn't have the retrospectoscope. Some of the methodological approaches were good, and, Fisher was smart, et cetera, et cetera. Eysenck responded with, were we really wrong? And suggested they were not wrong. And for this, he said, but were we wrong in the sense that the hypothesis criticised by us turned out to be right after all? I take leave to doubt this. Cornfield et al. Wrote in what Vanderbrugge calls the now classic paper on smoking and lung cancer that in order to be able to act as a confounder, a third variable should be an even stronger determinant of the disease. at issue than the actual determinant being studied, i.e. smoking. So your confounder has to be more strongly related to the outcome and the exposure. It has to be strongly related to the exposure, but it has to be more strongly related to the outcome than does the thing that's confounded. Our critics seem to imagine that no such determinant exists, but they are factually mistaken. Personality has been found to be very significantly more predictive in normal, healthy people of cancer and coronary heart disease than smoking. So it was, they'd been right. And studies by Eysenck, so these are, he didn't collect any of the data, but there's 4 first author papers by Eysenck, sole author papers by Eysenck on the data, and Grossoff, Matacek et al., only 3 citations of poor Ronald, are based on lengthy follow-up of large samples replicated twice and demonstrate this point quite convincingly. Hence, the very criterion suggested by Van der Broeke demonstrates that we were not wrong, even in this extended sense. And then he goes on to, advantages of smoking, benefits of smoking. In the first place, smoking confers substantial benefits on those who smoke. It raises cortical arousal, reduces boredom, reduces tension from stress, increases alertness, to name but 3 benefits, and there are references to his 1980 book with Lyndon Eaves on the causes and effects of smoking. And then, of course, to many people, these are vital, and being deprived of them is a serious issue. In the second place, the constantly repeated warnings against smoking cause stress in many people and may lead to illness and death. Reference 20. So who do we think reference 20 is to? The causal chain should be taken seriously from reference 20. Here's reference 20. It's is media information that smoking causes illness a self-fulfilling prophecy? Doesn't look, we don't really like it there with that retracted. So I'll tell you what, I'll clean that up for you. Here we go, you can get an unretracted version by going to hanseysenck.com. There's a website which just has all the retracted papers in their pristine form. So, and because, you don't have to go through any paywall, and they're all there. So the unretracted papers are being produced. This is something that surely a simple letter could point out that this is not correct to make this nonsense available. And that paper is just so bizarre. It's bizarre that firstly, it's bizarre that is this journal Psychological Reports? Is it a serious journal? It's just amazing. It's just extraordinary that this sort of stuff could get published in there. 190. They asked people about, are you convinced as a smoker that you'll be very likely to develop lung cancer, heart infarct, or some other smoking-related disease? 196 people said no. And if they said yes, what caused you to develop the conviction? You could say my own experience, public expositions and information, e.g. newspaper articles concerning the medical harm done by smoking, own experience as well as public information. And these are the results. This is obviously one of these cohorts that Tony talked about, these non-existent cohorts. So what you've got is, look at the survival. Only 91% of the people who get the information from newspapers. So this reading newspaper articles saying smoking is bad for you is up. It's about the same as a sort of shotgun, because the shotgun doesn't go off sometimes. So really, you shouldn't read those newspaper articles. I mean, they're just ludicrous, and they get into a journal. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And then the third thing, asking governments to intervene in the private affairs of individuals when the counter to the democratic desire for freedom and may lead to very undesirable consequences. We may recall the evils of prohibition. So he evokes Jerome Cornfield and saying that he can meet Cornfield's criteria. So this is a paper from the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. It's an absolutely classic paper, which put together all the evidence in 1959 about smoking and lung cancer and examined whether it was possible there was a confounding factor that generated the association. I put up this really poor copy because I got this from one of the tobacco industry websites, but I'd made it easier to get because I reprinted it in the International Journal of Epidemiology in 2009 because it is such an important paper. And Cornfield, in the simple form, just says, the magnitude of the excess lung cancer risk among smokers is so great that the results can't be interpreted as arising from an indirect association of cigarette smoking with some other agent or characteristic, since this hypothetical agent would have to be at least as strongly associated with lung cancer as cigarette use. No such agent has been found or suggested. But, he hadn't understood that Eysenck and Grosov-Matichek were going to find factors much more strongly related to lung cancer than smoking. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but the paper does, and worked since that in 1959. It's actually the sort of balance of, you have to have the balance of the prevalence of that factor, because you could have a factor which only 1 in 1,000 people have that virtually gives everyone lung cancer. But that obviously can't generate the level of the amount of disease in the population. So you have to have an absolute as well as a relative risk approach. And that relates to the prevalence of the confounder, and that's worked out in the appendix of the paper. And it's known as many things, including Cornfield's lemma, and you'll notice that this is in a book, Statistical Reasoning in Law and Public Policy, or it's in jury metrics. So the lawyers love this, because this is sort of often gets into court cases about whether the stuff that the company is making could really be killing people. But it's also known as Cornfield's lemma, law, inequality, rule, and conditions, and it's a very important epidemiological insight. In fact, there is a loophole to Cornfield's law, which is about measurement error. If you've got your two factors, what you think might be a cause and what is a confounder, if you measure the confounder, if you measure what is the actual cause badly, but you have a confounder that you measure really well, then you could actually get the wrong answer. And I wrote a paper in 1991 with Andrew Phillips on this, about how Cornfield's law depended on measurement error. We used this as an example, HDL cholesterol, which in 1991, and in fact until about 10 years ago, people were calling good cholesterol, thought it was beneficial, etc. That, your higher your HDL, the lower your coronary heart disease. Literally over $1 billion was spent on randomized trials of HDL, which had absolutely no effect on coronary heart disease. And we had said with some data that we thought that there was a confounding factor of what's called remnant cholesterol, which was actually leading to this. And I've published lots of stuff which is wrong, so we forget about that. But this one turned out to be right, and it was reprinted in 2020 to mark 30 years of it by a journal that asked us to write a commentary on it, which Andy and I did. And in that, I sort of went back again to look over it, and I was shocked that I'd missed the reference. I always want to look back and find the first person who actually developed something. And it turned out I referenced the 1977 book where I thought that this measurement error in confounders had first been discussed. But then I discovered the psychologist Robert H. Thewlis had introduced this, but for the correlation coefficient in a 1939 paper in British Journal of Psychology. He was a psychologist, but very highly skilled mathematician. We hinted that maybe his papers were not ceased to be read because it became very famous for having views on parapsychology, but also on the ability to communicate with the dead. And he in fact set himself up as an experiment for when he died. He was going to communicate with people. There was a sort of, he had to come back and answer some questions. No one actually got the answer. But there you go. Neglected maybe because of some strange beliefs. But of course, one of the things about Eysenck, and the stuff which relates to the custard, is of course he wrote loads of stuff on things like the paranormal. He did statistical studies on the paranormal and on astrology. Great believer in astrology. He thought there's a pair of husband and wife team from France who we thought were geniuses. I've forgotten their name, you might remember. Go Klein, yeah. Know Your Own PsyQ, Are you psychic, etc.? So he and Thouless maybe would have had something in common, except Thouless was a vastly better mathematician and wouldn't have published that nonsense. So now, I mentioned when we heard him, his response was, there's all this other stuff that's been published, and et cetera, et cetera. There's an absolutely classic mode, and right the way through his career, a lot of his work has led to highly numerate dissections by people who try and analyse the summary statistics and see whether they actually, even with the summary statistics, they're consistent. And so when his book, The Dynamics of Anxiety and Hysteria, came out, Storms and Siegel did a very detailed dissection of it, quite quantitative dissection. They raised issues of no cross-validation before considering a measure being useful or adequate, issues which came up obviously with the personality studies, failure to mention relevant test or population characteristics. I mean, none of the studies never have any descriptive variables. You're given nothing to tell you about these people who thought that the newspapers were killing. Failure to report relevant aspects to the method of test selection, tests of heterogeneity that variances, that's quite specific, but it's quite important. His implication that measures of personality dimensions based on these differences should be relatively stable, but no longitudinal studies carried out. So that's one of the most remarkable things which actually, of his work with Grosov-Maticek, which Ian Deary, who was introducing that talk, a young Ian Deary in 1994 introduced that talk. And Ian's comment at the end was, this is remarkable because, Eysenck had a 3-factor model and suddenly it had gone to 4 and 6, and you didn't really know whether it was 4 or 6 in these studies. And then secondly, that it changed. He thought there was very strong genetic contributions, it was a stable trait, etc. But now it was changeable. Not only was it changeable, you could change it so dramatically that you would massively change people's health and outcomes on the grounds of changing it. Factors are identified by the same name from one analysis to another. That is also something seen in this. And article is quoted or figure reproduced items which are not fully consistent with Eysenck's hypothesis may be altered or omitted. And that's the and there's a long response from Eysenck. And I'm not going to read out the first paragraph, but there's 4 things that he always does. Many of them have already been dealt with elsewhere. He says, I've dealt with this elsewhere, and gives a lot of references, and he hasn't. If he wishes to answer each point separately, his reply would become impossibly long, so I choose the ones that I can answer, not the ones I can't. The alternative method of answering only what would appear to be the main points easily lays him open to a charge of evasion, so it's really unfair on people making, you just make them subject to that. And Storms and Siegel go wrong, not so much in point of detail, although here they also make some curious mistakes and errors. And his reply to Tony, and I hadn't read it since it came out, but it's exactly this. This is it. This is describing it. But rather by having an altogether unrealistic notion of scientific methodology in general, you knew fuck all about scientific methodology. What were you doing, mate? About the genius and the question of proof in particular. They came back and they said, all you've done is quoted a lot of not published work, or work that wasn't published when we wrote our reply. And it just went on and on. But one of his early things, paper on neuroticism, which found it 90% heritable. Everything since has found much lower heritabilities, and a really, really incredibly detailed analysis of all the data they could get by Karen and Saunders to say, we believe neither the author's interpretation of their findings should be accepted simply because the statistical smokescreen is too dense to penetrate, nor that it should be rejected because it appears to contradict common experience. Rather, we believe the author's interpretation should be rejected or, at best, severely limited, primarily on the basis of the author's own report of their statistical procedures, i.e. what you can actually show with the data, which is definitely the case with the Grosov-Maticek and Eysenck stuff. There was one, he responded to everything, but there was one that came out in his lifetime that he didn't respond to, as far as I could see. He really did. Buchanan's book covers about how he responded, how he would always respond. He didn't reply to "Elvis is alive, the mafia killed JFK, and smoking is good for you," which is a review of his 1991 book. Now he's not a details man, and then maybe one reason why he's not a details man is also said in his autobiography. "I've always been an exceedingly fast reader. I could glance down a page for a few seconds and take in most or all of the useful information on that page. Once that is acquired, the information would stay in my memory for a long time. For many years, I used to read something like 3 books a day. So, not concentrating. That's why he could write in so many different fields." And Buchanan, in his biographies, looking at this sort of systematic pattern of behaviour, said Eysenck saw no value in telling psychological bulletin readers what he had done. In effect, he played a game of 20 questions with his critics, putting the onus on them to guess the correct answer if they felt obliged to make such checks. Eysenck otherwise implied that the level of detail they were demanding was unreasonable. Beyond that, he simply stood on his word. Either you believed the figures or you didn't. Now, there was his sort of academic, his intergenerational academic lineage maybe has some hints at some aspects of behaviour, and that is that his PhD supervisor was Sir Cyril Burt, who many of you will know the issue of certainly the massaging and probably invention of some of Burt's data that came out after Burt was dead. And Eysenck, when Burt died in 1971, Eysenck wrote an obituary published in 1972, which was laudatory of Burt. But later, when Henshaw's biography came out with all the damning details and other things, he moved in an opposite direction. So he had been very laudatory to his supervisor. But Burt actually gave advice to Eysenck in a letter in 1940. "I myself would prefer a tentative understatement rather than an emphatic overstatement, particularly when one is criticising rather eminent authorities." So the young Hans was obviously highly critical of eminent people. But as I say, Eysenck switched when Burt was under the whip. And he described Burt, an eminent British psychologist and my own teacher, was accused of having invented sets of twins and their IQ scores to strengthen his prior work on the genetics of intelligence. There's still some argument as to whether he did or did not, but most judges believe that there is something very fishy in these data, published well after his retirement. Why would a world-renowned expert do such a thing? And then in a chapter called Burt as a Hero and Anti-Hero, a Greek Tragedy, he said, "No certain verdict is possible in the allegation that he committed fraud. In view of such evidence as there is, not proven seems the most appropriate judgment, but most of his findings, whether factual or imagined, are well in line with earlier than later work." And did you hear the last thing he said in response to me? Have you heard it? I probably got to switch it off too soon. What he said is, if you take our work, Gross of Matter checks, and his work away, all these other studies that he was mentioning would show the same thing. These studies with relative risks of 1.4, which would show nothing like, it's where, quantity changes into quality. It's a dialectic situation. I mean, their massive effects were not what's seen with other data. So it's just not true in his case. His tragedy was to offend against political correctness, and so here Eysenck might be writing about himself with all his views on race, on the things he wrote on political, the psychology of political personality, etc., etc. And to be chosen as a major target for egalitarians who could not tolerate the variety of talents nature bestows on us. And he's saying that Eysenck, they'd been accused as being bystanders for not having gone through all the evidence, but few people can devote several years of their lives, there you go, to such a task. We are grateful for those who have laboured on our behalf. Who can have the time or the inclination to abandon his own work and set out on such a difficult and hazardous journey? And he carried on, many people have difficulties in understanding how a scientist can fraudulently fudge his data. The line of descent seems fairly clear. They have extremely high motivation to succeed in discovering the truth. The finest and most original discoveries are rejected by the vulgar mediocrities filling the ranks of orthodoxy. They're convinced that they have found the right answer. These are the geniuses. Newton believed it had been vouchsafed by God, to him by God, who explicitly wanted him to preach the gospel of divine truth. The figures do not quite fit, so why not fudge them a little bit to confound the infidels and unbelievers? Usually the genius is right, of course. Of course, all the geniuses are he. If he were not, we should not regard him as a genius, and we may, in retrospect, excuse his childish games, but clearly this cannot be regarded as a license for non-geniuses to foist their absurd beliefs on us. So there we go. So here's the paper published after his death, 2 years after his death, called Why Do Scientists Cheat? And in this, so rather surprisingly, you think about who are the scientists who cheat. It turns out that the scientists who cheat are those people who worked on AIDS, identified HIV as a major risk factor, and instigated programs. He said some extremely unpleasant things, which I'm not going to put on a slide, about the people who were dying of who died of AIDS. And he's the sort of writable forms are the result of homosexual practices and drug injection. Normal people are more likely to be killed by a thunderbolt than die of AIDS. And then he goes through, there's an AIDS mafia, there's a battle for money, there's selfish battle for money. This was a very bad case of deceit, fraud and pretense, aided and abetted by governments that no doubt will plead ignorance. So people working on AIDS were just in it for the money. And a similar fraud is being practiced in relation to smoking, and it's alleged killing of millions upon millions. But these fraudulent claims, so these are the fraudulent claims are the ones saying that smoking is bad for you. They're fraudulent claims. Do not strike at the heart of science. Most people will be able to recognize the absurdity of the allegedly scientific claims made in relation to AIDS and smoking. So how does this affect the creative scientist? Obviously, his ideas and experiments, being startlingly new, are far from perfect. It would be a miracle if they were, but any defect, real or imaginary, would be greeted with shouts of triumph by the mediocrity. What can he do? Tables and observations often have outlines. I think this is a misprint for outliers, I presume, that do not fit in. Perhaps they should be omitted. Westphal, who wrote a biography of Newton, discussed this process in detail in relation to Newton, and what he says there can perhaps be generalized to others. And of course, the others he is talking about is himself. So a few questions remain. Why don't all scientists cheat? Well, in the first place, the vast majority are crap. They're just boring, they just do rubbish. If you're sent by God, surely a few alterations and the numbers will not harm anyone. The arrogance of genius may persuade him that it is all for the best. After all, the genius is right by definition. What can be worse than to be aware of one's genius but be laughed at by the mediocrity because your proof is not absolute, as of course it cannot possibly be at an early stage. And finally, here for what they are worth are my cognitions on the murky subject. This is on Bert, sorry. Fraud is always bad, particularly in science. Can and should genius be forgiven because creativity is often persecuted? This is an ethical problem, and ethical problems are by definition insoluble. So, genius is, he's right, he's suggesting, probably should be forgiven. So I think Why Do Scientists Cheat is H.J. Eysenck's O.J. Simpson moment. This was the cover of O.J. Simpson's book, If I Did It, as it was supposed to appear. This was the book that he wrote, which basically said how he'd slaughtered his wife and her then partner. But he wrote it saying that this was like an imagination. He imagined what he would have done because he needed money. He was bankrupt. But the book this cover never appeared because the family of Goldman, the family got the rights to everything that was made by it because O.J. Simpson had lost in the interim of writing this book, lost the civil case. So they knew that this book was coming out and they got it extracted from it, and they had it published that in the eye they had the if was a little if inside the eye. So it was actually published as I Did It. But this, I think, is why do scientists cheat? Was Eysenck's O.J. Simpson moment, and Patrick Rabbit wrote a piece in the 2016 special issue that Tony mentioned, where he said that it's often said that the careers of politicians end in failure, but it's even more true of scientists. In the long run, we're all destined to be proved wrong or irrelevant. obliviousness to the mainstream currents in our subject throughout our working lifetimes accelerates this process. We may take comfort and even bitter pride in the narrative that we are not as widely acclaimed as we deserve because we are unfairly rejected. An alternative conclusion that our work, as is inevitable, has been or become of marginal interest is hard to bear. Because, of course, all successful scientists, but Newton included, very soon it is incorporated into the body of the science, and very soon the individual, except if you are Newton, except if you are one of the geniuses that Eysenck clearly thought he was, you slip. So you can't maintain, you don't maintain that position. So there's a sense where that's obviously inevitable, except for people who are Newton level. And Pat must have been at the same sort of tour that Eysenck was doing as that Tony and I went to. Pat was there, and he said his last encounter with Eysenck convinced me that he never endured this insight. 2 years before he died, he's present while he lectured a huge and admiring audience on the analysis of database and the effects of tobacco that was then suspected and now is known to be deeply dodgy. The strongest impression that I carried away was his utter conviction that he was right, and his even stronger conviction that all of his critics were wrong because they lacked the intelligence to appreciate his arguments, or because, though clever enough to appreciate him, they were malignly biased against him. What came over starkly was that, whether or not he believed that his data and his arguments were sound, even in his 80s, he was convinced that there could not possibly be anyone in the room who could successfully challenge him. Not a present last memory of a brilliant man. So, thank you.
Okay, so Larry and AB, we'll migrate over. Do you want to join us on the table? I've got some more today if you want to use it. So yes, take a seat. So what I'll do is I'll turn the mics on. So we are running slightly late, but the last time I had you speaking for us, Tony, we went over by 45 minutes. So 50 minutes is pretty good going. So what the ambition with this panel discussion is basically, thinking of the title of the talk, the legacy of the long shadow of that misconduct legacy can cast. What I'm eager to hear actually is with you, Dorothy, because it would be interesting to know your insights with your broad sort of range of expertise, not only from psychology, but also your experience with dealing with misconduct and improvements in research integrity. I mean, what are your sort of main reflections on the Eysenck case? What are your main sort of take-homes? And this could be in terms of, is this an outlier case? Or is this just one replication, to use an ironic choice of phrase, one replication of many other types of individuals that are still in existence? Or, is it just a damning indictment of how science was back then, but it's improved now, or is it still as bad now? I know I'm sort of playing softball questions, but I'll leave it with you to...
I'll try and not go on to it very long, because I think these two guys have got more interesting things to say. But I have to start by saying that my second published paper was critical of Eysenck. It was called The P-Scale and Psychosis. And it was exactly what you describe, in that as a student, I was here doing clinical psychology. We had just a couple of lectures by Eysenck, and I wanted to do my project. I think it was on the P-scale, and I started reading about the P-scale, and I realised that this is their, what was it, psychoticism scale, and I realised that the claims made in one of their papers were diametrically, didn't make sense. Things didn't add up. And so as a sort of young Turk, I wrote this thing, and I was actually really quite pleased because I smuggled through that we should really, because they were going on about males and females, I said at one point, perhaps we should really call it penis.
Very clever.
Got that in. But anyway, I mean, it was just what you say. It was this sort of amalgam of things that didn't match. And I remember raising it, not with Eysenck himself, but with Sybil, and it was sort of, it was the same slippery, though. It was sort of, not ever engaging, really, with a serious criticism. And yes, I have to say that this is a lot of what you're saying is very familiar with other people who one tries to pull up. And I think it's almost worth, perhaps we should make a scale to diagnose this, of what are the characteristics of these people, because you can waste hours with them. And it is the wading through treacle thing. I mean, they sort of basically stop you getting anywhere by bogging you down, because you just can never reach closure on any one argument, because they will come up with exactly these arguments. The other thing I found quite funny, which of you was it? Was it you that said, when you raised a criticism, you said, I wished you'd phoned me up? Yeah, now that's pretty diagnostic. I get this all the time on PubPeer, and other people get it on PubPeer, that you put a question on PubPeer about some aspect of somebody's data, and if the ones that are deeply dodgy always reply by saying, sort of wounded and hurt that you should have raised this on PubPeer. Why didn't you email me about this? You know, they want to take it off. They want it away from public discourse. Which, if it's just a simple scientific discussion, why can't it be? And why wouldn't they want other people who had that question in their mind to be aware of the answer and so on? So that is fairly standard. But I am very curious about the psychology of, you know, as a psychologist, I'm curious about, as Eysenck himself seemed to be, about the psychology of these people. But I don't think they've gone away. I think they exist in all areas of science. And it is very, very challenging once they achieve the status of the grand person for anybody to sort of really take them on. And Eysenck had it absolutely right in the sense that it will destroy you. It will take up all your time battling these people because they have strategies to somehow always get around it. But I think all one can take comfort from is the fact that in the long run, you know, the history usually seems to get it right.
As far as we know, yeah.
So just a word to the people in the audience. You can ask questions in the Q&A. They are moderated, so I will just publish them as we go. Are there any questions from the audience? Whilst people are, whilst I'm walking, one question I have is, where is the data? Where are the data? I mean, can we have access to it? What's the story there?
Yeah, Rod Buchanan describes. Rod Buchanan describes going to visit Gross Arithmetic in Heidelberg, and he brings out. So anyone can look at my data, and he brings out these books and shows. Look at all that data. Look at all the data. There you are. Look at any time you want. So Gross Arithmetic has some stuff. But then when somebody did, a psychologist, Dr. Vanderploeg, tried to look into this, they ended up saying, oh, Vanderploeg, he hates us, he's malign against us, he's deliberately putting us down. So Gross Arithmetic claims there's data, and
is it the case that Sybil destroyed his files, or is that?
You knew that that's in Rod Buchanan's book. Immediately after Hans's death, his wife Sybil got in a company and shredded all his data, destroyed all of his papers, in a drop, and Rod Buchanan goes into that, with the problems that created.
Yeah, question to the floor?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Fran Denk. I'm a psychologist by training. In fact, I studied Dorothy. I think you might have given some lectures for me at Oxford's undergrad. But I sort of came back to the psychology field and all the great stuff that you've been doing about reproducibility. So thank you very much. Right now, I work more in pain and sort of medical research. And I just want to say, first of all, yes, I think for sure this is in all fields. I would say in my field, about 10% of people that we just ignore because everyone assumes they just make stuff up. And we just let them be the way that you were explaining. People let Hans Eysenck be, just saying, yeah, the crazy guy, right? So my question to you is a little bit along what you were saying. should we let them be? Because are we wasting so much time? And should we, rather than with grant applications, making sure that we try and prevent them from getting money rather than preventing them from randomly, contributing to the literature, which is anyway rubbish?
So I could talk very briefly about two other cases of literally impossible data that I've been involved in, where it was very obvious you shouldn't let them be because those data were having a real impact in the fields, and then they can't be let be. Now, I think some people say to me about the Eysenck issue is, well, now everyone knows that it's fraudulent. It still does occasionally get included, but in some systematic reviews, etc. But basically, because he was so high profile, that's been disseminated across people who are interested in psychosocial factors and health. I was involved in a case that was an important randomized trial from India that was supposedly a sort of cholesterol-lowering trial, which it just had implausibly good results. And a year after it was published, Paul McKeegan and I wrote to the BMJ to say that this just can't be. And then the BMJ sort of started an investigation. It was from a small town in India. The person running the studies had published about 35 trials. If the town and the surrounds weren't large enough to have enough, they were all secondary prevention of coronary heart disease trials, but there just simply couldn't have been enough people to have had heart attacks to get in these trials. The termites had eaten the data, etc. Now, the issue with that is that the BMJ did eventually issue in 2005, so it took 13 years of time, 12 years. They eventually put out an expression of concern with it, but it's never been retracted. And sometimes that does slip back into being included in reviews, but most of the reviews, the Cochrane reviewers don't include it. But because the BMJ was so slow to act, another trial by this group got published in The Lancet in 2002, and they'd learnt by the experience of the 1992 paper, they'd actually worked out not to actually give summary data that you could actually recalculate the p-values and show the p-values didn't match what they showed, etc. They'd actually simulated data, analysed simulated data. So it didn't have, and without getting the real data. They added on a senior person as a senior author from a nutritionist from Israel who had never visited the site, and that got. And eventually a notice of concern came out for that. But those did have an impact. They were sort of showing aspects of diet that were supposedly beneficial. And I won't go into the other one. But I do think there's an issue about what is the impact, and there's a real problem of notices of expressions of concern. They're retracted with the retracted stamped across it, although you can put the papers up on a website, etc. Will get more widely known. And now, if you go and look at these papers on the BMJ or Lancet website, there's nothing to tell you that there's nothing even to point you to the notice of concern, the expressions of concern. So, but I do think there's an aspect of is this having detrimental effects? And I mean, in the early days, stuff got included in systematic reviews and stuff.
And the poor systematic reviewers, they haven't redone their systematic review, and it did influence the summary statistics as well. So influential, and I mean, it could affect public health, but also, is it this undermining of science as well? We can't put our house in order.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why people don't act, and perhaps I should, devil's advocate, perhaps sort of put the case for these institutions that are so loath to act. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a concern about undermining trust in science. Whereas, as I've said, I think the way you get trust in science is by doing trustworthy science and showing you are cleaning up your house. But it's very clear from what you've been saying, and certainly other cases I'm aware of, that this threat of legal action is really a worry. and it is used by quite a lot of fraudulent individuals to silence opposition, and those sorts of cases go on for years. If you personally get sued, you may be stuck at threat of losing huge sums of money and the stress of a legal case for years. Those are two reasons. The third reason that I was talking to somebody over coffee about is, of course, you have to also always be aware that whatever tactic we want to use against the fraudsters could be turned against us. In the modern age, there are instances of people being accused of fraud, being told, people saying you should be sacked from your institution because they are coming out with research that some group of people don't like the results of. And so this is one of the reasons it makes it very hard to steer the right course. And of course, on top of that, you don't want to accuse people unfairly. And so sometimes there's a genuine concern that you might be treating somebody as guilty without inadequate evidence. And so I think that's the difficult path to steer. And any solutions we try to build to this, we have to always keep that in mind, the possible weaponization of anything that we do against people who don't deserve to have this thrown at them.
Yeah. So I got a cease and desist order for 10 crore rupees. A crore is 10 million. So that was 100 crore rupees. A sort of notary delivered a cease and desist order, which I pinned to my office door, and it I didn't cease and desist. But
So it didn't go any further. But I mean, if they wanted to put it further, they could have made your life hell.
Yeah.
I guess I know that you're next. Sorry, I'm just taking privilege here. Sorry. With the King's inquiry, one of the things that came up at the time was that it was unclear how they arrived at what they referred to as unsafe. And I guess I'm curious, back on what Dorothy said, would it help if there was more transparency in how these cases are dealt with? How do they arrive at it? And maybe as a community we could learn and arrive at a sort of common approach. I mean, that's a very poorly formulated and I know a naive question, but I did submit a freedom of information, and the individuals on the committee was not disclosed, and so even the people on the committee is unknown, let alone how they arrived at those decisions.
So what happened with your freedom of information request? It was turned down?
No, it was responded to, and they said that the people on the committee will remain nameless to protect their identity, and of course there will be potential blowback for them, I guess. It's been a few years since I sent it. I was aware that it was quite a few other FOIs as well, probably all from Tony, but
FOIs about that particular inquiry?
About the inquiry, to find out who was on it.
I didn't know that, yeah.
Yeah, to find out who was on it, and we have we'll leave that hanging, but you have a question, sorry.
Yeah, hi, it was a really great chat. I had a question actually about papers that have been retracted. They go to all the trouble of, investigating, put the names on it, words and everything. Why are they not redacting the details? Because, of course, things with ChatGPT, when you extracting information, it still comes up as a paper. So is there a possibility to redact the information?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite... Did you hear that?
Should they be redacted rather than retracted?
I think the general view is that it's important to have the scientific record, an integrity of the scientific record, and that you need to see what was published, but with a big retraction notice very evidently across it, because otherwise if things were just removed and then other people have maybe cited that work or something and it's not visible. I think there is a case occasionally for things being completely removed, but I think that's under very rare circumstances. I can't remember what the rare circumstances are, but I think the general argument is that it's part of the scholarly record, even though it was subsequently retracted, and the scholarly record should be left intact, but with a big notice slashed across it.
Yeah, and I guess reference managers software like Zotero, they're quite good. I mean, if people use them, of course, they're quite good at flagging if the paper has been retracted. But yeah, we have another question on the floor.
Although, and some of these retracted papers are sometimes still cited, though. That people might have it in a copy in the library or in the Eysenck archive, and it's cited. And I told a researcher in the States about this, and he was very upset actually that he included one of their papers. It was still only in the inquiry. It hadn't quite been retracted. But he was really upset. I didn't know, and he felt bad about it, and had to redo his meta-analysis.
Question up there?
I'm not even sure if it's a question. It's more of the observation. Surely the journals are peer-reviewed, so that's the whole point of their existence, right? And yet they don't seem to bear much responsibility. There doesn't seem that there is like a legal implication for them if they keep publications that are fraudulent. So I just wonder, or is there?
I think they're much more worried about illegal consequences of doing a retraction. The original author, there are cases where the original authors have then come after them and, sort of tried to sue them for retracting an article. I mean, certainly there is this you get this sense that there's a very strong psychology that amongst both researchers and journals that once something is published, it's interesting that science isn't seen as this process of incremental improvement. It's like we've now got this thing done, closed, and there's very, very strong pressures against doing anything further. Now, I personally favour a publication model which isn't like that, but which does treat research as incremental, and there are now some journals that will allow you to publish a paper and then publish an update to the paper and an update to the paper together with post-publication peer review, which is much more how things really, really happen. But our model is very much of, the product is the paper, and once it's done, you're not going to undo it.
But
So I think this is not a reflection of what I saw from you guys. But in general, I think there's a kind of adversarial approach. And I just wondered if there's a route for kindness in the role of bringing up issues between researchers. Because I just see, if I go on BMJ, I just see right to reply. And it's kind of, I don't know, I imagine the person shouting at the writer.
I think that what happens is, I generally try to be sort of sweet and nice and kind to people, but I have to say, when you're up against a phenomenon like this, you do get cross, and it's very hard to, remain professional and polite, let alone kind. So I don't...
George, could it be more kind? And then once again, I'm certainly in my case, I was hoping to, but look, here are the numbers. This is the numbers, and then bringing in the only bit maybe I had knowledge that Eysenck and Gross-Alexandria didn't have, said, look, what is the meaning of what you're describing at the back of people's eyes? And I like to think that I just did that. It's over to you. I think you do, though. You can't help being annoyed as you put it over, though. You can't help, and I've tried to be diplomatic. I've tried to be diplomatic throughout all this, but you have the adversarial things, and I get the impression nowadays with social media that it gets worse. That there's even more adversarial type of things with these things.
Although I think in face-to-face interactions, it's become much less common. We're a generation where it was very normal in talks for people to be quite adversarial, and I think that's toned down a lot. But I think it still continues in sort of written communications, and yes, you're right, on social media it can go pretty wild. But I think there comes, I almost feel that there's a cut-off point for me, and that, if somebody's just said something, if there's honest error, or if there's, somebody's just not very bright and doesn't understand something, that's one thing. But if somebody's really, you feel, persistently, deliberately misunderstanding a point that you're trying to make, and getting advantage from it and, adopting all the tricks, really. There comes a point when you just think, no, okay, the time has come. Now it's sort of thermonuclear war.
I know we've got a couple of questions. We'll probably wrap up at about 1:45. I just wanted to quickly ask, because I guess this is what I tried to probe earlier, Dorothy, with my question to you. But Tony, I remember in your talk that you gave a few years ago that you imagine, if Hans was in the audience and you made that comment about, this is the pinnacle of human inquiry, and your reaction was, what would Hans' reaction be to that? And you were persuaded that he would actually say, yeah, that's right, Dr. Pelosi. That it is.
I think he would.
And so my question is that, although there is a time and a place for being rough and ready and maybe compassionate, but it sounds like he was convinced that he was right, that he thought the evidence was completely legitimate. How do you deal with somebody who is so set and so wrapped up in their own confirmation bias? How do you shake them from that and make them realise that, or is there something else? Was he just, a shill for big tobacco?
Are there any psychologists in the room? All of you, how do you? Because it's psychiatry. That was one of the things in one of the email exchanges I had. Was he going dementing? Was he dementing late in life? And I was saying, now wait a wee minute. Look, what was it? Well, look what was happening in the 80s, the 70s, and now in fact, listening to George, going right back. So psychiatry and neuropsychiatry has nothing to offer here. Over to psychology. What? And his answer would be, not only was he a genius, so I remember he was a genius, and Ronald Grossarth-Maticek, who recognised how great he was, and he was one of his proteges, Ronald was also a genius, and that's then genius squared. So that would be why they would come up with the pinnacle of all human achievement.
And all these comments that George was reading out about, that was a very informative article, that last one. But, the attitude towards people who criticise them is, you are just nitpickers. You are not geniuses. You are stupid people who haven't got the creativity or no imagination. You can't see it. And you're going to worry about the little details, whereas I've got this great truth, which is another reason why I don't feel very kind. I'm going to be dismissed as nitpicker.
Nitpicking.
We'll go here.
Nitpicking, yeah.
Hello, thank you for the discussion. So after those papers got retracted, I wonder what happened to those papers that also cited or be inspired by those retracted papers, and because they are sort of victims. So I wonder if one day we're also one of the victims, then what should we do? What do we do? Yep.
Can I just add to that question as well? What about the other authors on those papers?
What about
the other authors that are also on those papers? What about those? Because we talk about victims, but there are it's not just all single author papers. There are multiple authors that are not just Grossarth. Let's check.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, one meta-analyst has gone back with a letter to the editor. So he had to go and redo his work. But that isn't usually happening. The main meta-analysis on psychosocial issues and cancer, very, very carefully, meticulously done. It sits there in the literature. It's not been changed. The authors commented to another critic years ago. There's a letter in the editor, but it's not changed. They've not changed the meta-analysis, and it dominates that.
I think something about the
so there's that one. But then and the co-authors is Eysenck's co-authors. I mean, I've looked at some of the ones, especially on those expressions of concern. These are very, very good, very sound scientists, and I think they just have to say they are part of collateral damage for behaviour like this. Because I don't know what else should they be right. They may well write in, but something that happened 30, 40 years ago, can they do that? And do it, yeah. So
we'll go here, then Tim, and then back again, if that's okay. So did you
So thank you so much. Yeah, it's great discussion. My question is more related to what, based on these retracted papers and the scientists, like the information that then enters the general public, business world, like anything that can be made profitable in the corporate world, and those really seem to stay there even after papers are retracted. So how do you fight that, or what do you do with that?
I don't know, and in these tobacco documents, these things where they were forced to release all the documents, every document done by the tobacco industry, there is clear letters, discussions saying this is Grosshath Macheck's a charlatan. And then even within the same committee, well, but this is important, we'll give him 50,000 Deutschmarks to continue his work. So the tobacco companies had other imperatives for them, and it just went on and on with them. So I don't know the answer about what happens then in wider society and in business, and yeah.
Hello, thank you for the really nice and thorough talk. I have one quite long-winded question. Sorry. So basically what I perceived was that you said the first 3 publications to sort of raise queries about Eysenck's theory on, I don't know, personality.
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing you. I don't know. Can you talk a bit louder?
Okay. So, Tony, you sent 3 publications initially, I believe, to try and question Eysenck's validity of his paper and his thesis and things like that. So my question is, as a scientist, well, in that little room in KCL, there was one particular person that was asking questions, which was like, was really getting to nitty-gritty of his, his results and analyzing his results. And even then, you still have people that, like you said, still cite Eysenck today. So as a scientist, when you are reading a paper, maybe not by someone as obviously, not demented, but as obviously, creative as Eysenck, how would you be able to determine how you should criticize his paper? Because technically you're also not his paper, but anyone else's paper, you're also basing your critique on the information that you have read, which I believe you would have to have also critiqued as a valuable source of, background for you to say, now this doesn't really make sense, if it's not as obvious as Eysenck. I mean, to some people, even Eysenck's paper is not that obvious because they still cite it.
Yeah, but it's not as obvious. I mean, some of the things it is, and George has done some stuff that's something, it hits you between the eyes about how ridiculous it is. It is, what is more difficult is that thing where it's not obvious, maybe even not obvious to oneself doing one's research. And I don't know the answer, I don't know how to deal with that, except maybe this open science movement. Yeah, an incremental thing where we try, at least we try, and at least there's transparency. Dorothy,
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of I've sort of been latched on to a very interesting project run by Jack Wilkinson in Manchester, which is an attempt to devise criteria when you're screening papers for systematic reviews. And it's really more to sort of weed out the ones that it's not a sort of classic sort of quality of evidence sort of thing. It's more, what things like impossible data. And it's striking how quite a lot of the things that you're supposed to be looking at do require some sort of expertise in the area. So things like knowing that George knowing you couldn't recruit that many people in this place with that sort of condition. I've come across examples of that, not from Eysenck but from other places. But or people describing selection criteria for a study that they're doing, and in an area that I do know about, and I just know nobody would use those selection criteria because they're so stringent you'd end up with no cases. So, and you know, impossible effect sizes, which if you know the field, you know the sort of effect sizes you might get. Don't know the field, you might not. So there's a sort of, the more experienced you are in an area, I think the easier it is to just look at something and think, whoa, that really doesn't make sense. But there's the other thing is, once you've identified somebody's doing this and you're pretty confident that it's not just honest error and it's not just, you know, a mistake made on a one-off, you typically find it's never just one paper, it's always several. So then you start looking at their other work with a much more critical eye.
Yeah.
I'm going to call time, I think, because I think I need a drink. And I think, just to, not to have the final word, but I think it's interesting what you say, because Diederik Stapel says something where once he started, he couldn't stop.
Yes. Yeah, because you get so much better data when you do it that way.
It's so much easier.
Yeah.
Why bother collecting data when you can make it up and prove your point? So I'll finish on that. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Sorry that we weren't able to answer all the questions for those joining in at home. Can we all have another round of applause for a brilliant... So there is drink, but you have to work for it. So you have to walk to the education hub. I will lead the way, if you like, but it's literally over there. But yes, thank you all. Everybody who's joining the in-person workshops for the rest of the week, all the material is available for you there. Tomorrow we will be in the SGDP, so please make sure you go there and not here. And one final word, I've just remembered because I've just looked at Louise there. The link to the report for the inquiry that KCL did is now no longer giving you the 404 error. It's now being fixed. So if there's one outcome from today, is that we fixed the link. Brilliant. Well, thank you again, everyone, and have fun drinking.